January 1547, Whitehall Palace, London. The air hung thick and cold, not merely with the chill of the English winter, but with a palpable sense of dread that seeped from the very stones of the king's private apartments. Officially, it was the passing of a titan, a monarch whose will had reshaped a nation and defied the might of Rome. The chronicles would record his death on the 28th of January, a natural end to a life lived large and loud. But the truth, like so many things in the Tudor court, lay shrouded in layers of political expediency, fear, and a carefully constructed silence. Our deep dive begins not with the moment of death, but in the long, agonizing months that preceded it. The Henry VIII of popular imagination, the robust, athletic king of his youth, was long gone. By his final year, he was a ruin. His once imposing frame was bloated, his face a mask of pain and exhaustion. The infamous leg ulcer, a festering wound that had plagued him for years, now consumed him, a constant source of agony and a potent, sickening odor that no amount of incense or perfume could entirely mask. But the physical decay, horrific as it was merely the visible manifestation of a deeper, more disturbing decline. The secret we seek to unravel is not just how he died, but who was truly in control during those final, critical weeks, and what truths were deliberately buried alongside the king in St. George's Chapel. Step back into the hushed corridors of Whitehall. The king was isolated, not just by illness, but by design. Access was strictly controlled. The Privy Council, a body swollen with ambitious men like Edward Seymour, John Dudley, and William Paget, formed an impenetrable barrier around the dying monarch. Physicians came and went, their faces grim and guarded, their prescriptions a desperate, often contradictory, mix of poultices, purges, and prayers. But were they merely treating a dying man, or were they managing a situation? The official narrative speaks of a king who, though ill, remained sharp-witted, dictating his will, making final decisions. But whispers from those few who penetrated the inner sanctum told a different story. A story of a mind that drifted, of moments of lucidity punctuated by spells of confusion, rage, or a terrifying vacant silence. The pain was constant, dulling his senses, clouding his judgment. He was often heavily medicated, perhaps deliberately so. Consider the physicians. Men of science, yes, but also men utterly dependent on the king's favor, and increasingly on the favor of the powerful counselors, who now held the reins. Their notes, if they were truly honest, would have painted a picture of a man less and less capable of coherent thought, let alone the complex affairs of state. Yet, the official records maintain a facade of royal command right up to the end. This discrepancy is the first thread of our mystery. Why maintain this fiction? The answer, of course, lies in power. The succession was paramount. The heir, Prince Edward, was a boy of 9. A power vacuum loomed. The men who controlled the king's final moments would control the transition and potentially the regency. A king seemed to be fully in command, making clear, final decisions. Legitimize their positions and the structure of the Regency Council he supposedly appointed, a king revealed to be incapacitated, perhaps even raving, into doubt, inviting challenges and chaos. So, the silence began. The king's true state was downplayed, his moments of clarity exaggerated, his periods of absence explained away. The doors to his chamber became not just a barrier against infection, but a shield against inconvenient truths. Those who saw him, those who heard him in his unguarded moments, understood the implicit threat. Speak of what you truly witnessed, and face the consequences. The atmosphere in Whitehall was one of suffocating tension. Every cough from the king's room, every hushed conversation in the antechamber, was freighted with significance. The future of England hung precariously on the failing breath of its monarch, and a select few were determined to ensure that future unfolded precisely as they intended, regardless of the king's actual capacity to direct it. The secret, therefore, is not a single dramatic act, but a sustained, deliberate campaign of concealment. It is the story of a king whose mind and body failed him, and whose final days were not spent in sovereign command, but in a state of managed decline, his voice increasingly silenced by the pain, the medication, and the calculated actions of the men who stood to gain most from his passing. The official history is the polished surface. The truth lies in the dark, airless space behind the locked doors. In the unspoken fears of the physicians, and in the cold, calculating eyes of the counselors who waited for the inevitable end, ensuring that when it came, it served their purpose perfectly. This is where our deep dive truly begins. The silence in the sovereign's antechamber was a heavy shroud, thicker than the velvet drapes that blocked out the weak winter light. It was the silence of waiting, but also the silence of suppression. The official pronouncements spoke of a grievous fever, a natural decline hastened by age, but the air here, thin and stale behind the locked doors, hummed with a different truth. Master Theron, the sovereign's chief physician, moved with the weary grace of a man trapped between his oath and his fear. His official reports, penned in careful script and reviewed by the council before dispatch, detailed the expected progression of the declared illness. Yet his private journal, a slim volume bound in worn leather and hidden beneath loose floorboards in his own quarters, told a different story. It spoke of symptoms that flared and receded with unnatural speed, of a pallor that wasn't merely sickly, but bore a faint, almost iridescent sheen in certain lights. It noted the sovereign's sudden violent tremors dismissed by the council, as delirium that seemed less like fevered fits and more like a body fighting a foreign invader. Most unsettling were the periods of chilling lucidity, moments when the sovereign's eyes would fix on Theron, filled not with the fog of fever, but with a desperate knowing terror before the tremors would seize him again. These moments were never mentioned in the official reports, conflicting accounts. Swirled like dust motes in the sunbeams that occasionally pierced the gloom, the kitchen staff whispered of the sovereign, refusing all food and drink for days. Yet a scullery maid, since reassigned to the furthest wing of the palace, swore she saw a counselor's personal attendant deliver a small, sealed ceramic vial to the sick room only the night before the final collapse. The captain of the guard maintained strict records of all who entered and left the inner chambers. Yet his logs for the critical week showed curious gaps, entries scratched out or missing entirely, particularly concerning the late-night visits. Of the inner council members, one entry barely legible beneath heavy ink seemed to mention a cloaked visitor, unannounced, but the rest was obscured. Then there was the smell. Not the expected scent of sickness and medicinal herbs, but something else, faint yet persistent. Clinging to the heavy tapestries and the sovereign's own linens, a cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit or a forgotten perfume that Theron couldn't identify but found deeply unsettling. He had found a small, intricately carved wooden box tucked beneath the sovereign's bed, empty save for a lingering trace of that same strange aroma. When he cautiously showed it to the council's appointed liaison, the object was quickly confiscated, dismissed as a childhood keepsake of no consequence, its return denied. The counselors themselves were a constant chilling presence. Their faces, etched with concern in public, were masks of cold calculation in the shadowed corridors. They controlled access, dictated which remedies were administered, often overriding Theron's own recommendations with chilling certainty, and seemed less interested in the sovereign's recovery than in managing the narrative of his decline. Their questions to Theron were not about the patient's well-being, but about the timing, how long, how soon could an official pronouncement be made. Their hurried, hushed meetings in rooms adjacent to the sick chamber felt less like worried consultations and more like strategic planning sessions. The truth, Theron suspected, was not a single event, but a slow, deliberate unraveling, orchestrated by hands that moved in the dark. The fever was real, perhaps, but it was a curtain behind which something far more sinister was allowed, or perhaps helped, to take root. The locked doors didn't just keep the world out, they kept the secrets in, suffocating the truth in the same airless space where the sovereign drew his last. Labored breaths, surrounded not by loyal subjects, but by the architects of his carefully managed demise, the empty box, the missing log entries, the cloying scent. The whispered accounts of a mysterious vial and a cloaked visitor, they were not disparate oddities, but threads of a tapestry woven in shadow, a pattern only beginning to reveal its deadly design, a design whose final stitch was the sovereign's silence. The air in the sovereign's chamber, thick with a cloying, unnatural sweetness, seemed to cling to the velvet drapes and the hushed breaths of the figures gathered. They stood not in grief, but in a tableau of calculated solemnity. Their faces masks of appropriate sorrow that barely concealed the glint of anticipation in their eyes. Lord Valerius, the Chancellor, his jowls trembling slightly, was the first to break the silence, his voice a low, resonant rumble. His Majesty has passed. A sudden, tragic affliction. But the royal physician, Master Ilara, summoned with unseemly haste, felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the chill seeping from the stone floor. Her practiced eye scanned the scene. The sovereign lay unnaturally still, his features composed in a way that spoke less of peaceful rest and more of a sudden violent cessation. The pallor was extreme, almost waxy, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible blueness around the lips that Elare couldn't reconcile with the sudden affliction Valerius had pronounced. She approached the bed, her movements slow and deliberate. Acutely aware of the eyes fixed upon her, the scent was strongest here, a sickly floral note beneath the heavy perfume of the chamber. Her gaze fell upon the bedside table. The ornate silver box, usually holding the sovereign's personal seal, and a small leather-bound journal, was indeed empty. But beside it, partially obscured by a discarded linen, lay something else. A single, perfectly formed white petal, stark against the dark wood. It was unlike any flower known to bloom in the palace gardens, its texture almost unnaturally smooth. Knelt, feigning a closer examination of the body. Her fingers brushed the sovereign's neck. No obvious marks, no signs of struggle. Yet the skin felt cold, too cold, faster than a natural passing should dictate. She noted the position of the limbs, the slight rigidity already setting in, inconsistent with the reported time of death barely an hour prior. Master Ilara, Valerius prompted, his tone edged with impatience. Your findings, she straightened, forcing her expression into one of professional gravity. His Majesty appears to have succumbed to a rapid internal collapse. My Lord Chancellor. The symptoms are consistent with a sudden and severe onset. She chose her words carefully, omitting the unsettling details. The unnatural cold, the blue tinge, the strange petal. To speak them aloud here, now, felt like signing her own death warrant. Later, in the hushed corridors, whispers circulated like drafts through the ancient stone. A scullery maid, dismissed from duty near the sovereign's wing just before the alarm, was raised, swore she'd heard raised voices, not of pain, but of sharp, clipped commands. A junior guard, posted near a rarely used service entrance, claimed to have seen a cloaked figure slip out into the pre-dawn mist, moving with unnatural speed, carrying something small and dark. These accounts, disparate and easily dismissed as rumor or fear-induced fantasy, were quickly stifled by senior officers and palace stewards, their loyalty now seemingly pledged elsewhere. The official narrative solidified with chilling speed. The sovereign, weakened by age and recent illness, an illness no one had previously mentioned, had passed peacefully in his sleep. The palace logs for the crucial hours leading up to the discovery were conveniently missing. Attributed to a clerical error, the chamber was sealed, access restricted, the strange scent masked by liberal application of incense. The physician, and for the few others who had seen or heard something they shouldn't have, the silence was not peace. It was the heavy, suffocating blanket of a truth being buried alive. The empty box, the missing logs, the cloying scent, the whispered accounts, the mysterious vial. The suppressed whispers, they were not just threads anymore. They were tightening cords, binding the palace in a web of complicity and fear. A web whose center was the cold, silent chamber, and whose weavers were now the undisputed masters of the realm. The final stitch had been sewn, but the pattern of the deadly design was far from complete. It was merely entering its terrifying second phase. The silence that descended upon the palace was not the peace of grief, but the suffocating quiet of a predator's lair after the kill. It pressed down on the heavy tapestries, muffled the footfalls of the few permitted to move, and made the creak of a distant door sound like a thunderclap. The air itself felt thinner, colder, carrying the faint metallic thames of something recently scrubbed away. The masters of the realm, cloaked in their newfound authority, did not emerge into the light. Instead, their will filtered down through layers of newly appointed, unnervingly loyal intermediaries, men and women whose eyes held a chilling blend of fear and fanaticism. The official pronouncement, delivered with almost indecent haste by a previously obscure functionary now elevated to prominence, spoke of a sudden, peaceful passing in the night, a heart ailment finally claiming its victim. It was a narrative spun thin, easily pierced by the sharp point of reality. There was no public viewing of the body, no traditional period of mourning, declared with the customary tolling of bells across the city. The cold, silent chamber remained sealed, guarded by men whose faces were unknown, their armor lacking the familiar crests of the royal guard. Access was denied to all, even the most trusted physicians and the highest-ranking members of the clergy who would perform the rites. But the whispers, though suppressed, did not die. They mutated, twisting the official lie into grotesque shapes. Some spoke of poison, swift and undetectable. Others of a struggle, a desperate fight against overwhelming odds, leaving marks that could not be shown. A particularly persistent rumor, originating from a scullery maid who had since vanished, spoke of a strange, acrid smoke that had briefly curled from beneath the chamber door late that night, carrying a smell like burnt herbs and something else, something animal, or perhaps metallic. Then there were the details that didn't fit any simple tale of death. A specific, heavy silver key, known to hang always from the belt of the deceased, was missing from its usual place, yet it was not found within the sealed chamber. A particular set of astronomical charts, meticulously kept and consulted nightly, were also gone, and a low-ranking scribe, known for his obsessive note-taking and his habit of lingering near the royal apartments, was reported absent from his post the morning after. His small room found undisturbed, save for a single, hastily drawn symbol on the wall above his cot, a complex knot that no one recognized, but which felt, instinctively, wrong. Not just signs of a cover-up. They were threads of a different weave entirely. The official story was a flimsy curtain, hiding not just a crime but perhaps a ritual, a transaction, or the unleashing of something far more complex and terrifying than a simple power grab. The second phase was not merely the consolidation of power through fear. It was the implementation of the deadly design, a pattern whose true nature remained. Shrouded in the impenetrable silence of the sealed chamber and the unsettling actions of those who now held the keys to the realm. The mystery had only just begun to unfold its darker, more intricate layers. The archives are now sealed. The full truth may never be known, leaving only whispers and shadows in the pages of history. Some stories are best left buried,